So we will move to the next session, which is the best paper talk session. The first talk will be building ethical AI, federated learning meets fairness and differential privacy by Manisha Padala, Sankarshan Damle and Sujit Gujar. So over to Manisha. So you have 20 minutes.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Thanks. I think you may also have to share your screen.
Yeah, I have shared it. Is it visible?
Yes, yes.
Thank you. So, hi all. I am Manisha from IIIT Hyderabad. I'm a PhD student under Dr. Sujit Gujar. This is our work on building an ethical AI, wherein we try to incorporate fairness constraints and privacy guarantees within our federated learning framework. We are very grateful for this opportunity to present our abstract. So let's move on. So the agenda for today is we'll introduce our framework, then we'll discuss certain goal, the goal of our work. We'll formally define the ethical notions, which is the fairness constraint and the privacy guarantees that we are handling in this particular work. Then we'll discuss our framework, which is the fair and private federated learning framework, and followed by certain results. So with deep learning, given sufficient data, we are easily able to learn the mapping between an given input and an output efficiently compared to the existing machine learning or other approaches, especially when there is enough computational resources and sufficient data. So there are various applications. In this work, we are focusing on classification tasks, which could be for facial recognition, facial attribute recognition, which are very much used nowadays. They are also used for aiding human-based evaluation, especially in recruitment sectors, where you're trying to evaluate if a candidate is suitable for a certain job or not. It is also being used in criminal justice for predicting the rate of recidivism for a particular criminal. It is also being used in healthcare for the diagnosis of a certain disease based on X-ray images, etc. So all of these are very interesting applications of deep learning and have been successfully used, being deployed in various places. But still, the major challenge of all these things include the collection of data. We need huge amount of data, the training time, and also the memory requirement to store all this data at a single place. So outsourcing of training the model has been really used recently by researchers, which is also in some sense the model of federated learning, where there are multiple agents in the system. All these agents have their own private data. So a central body or a central aggregator is going to send in a randomly initialized model to all of these agents. Now, these agents, what will they do is they will train the model on their own private data. After the training is done, they'll send this model back to the central aggregator without revealing their personal data. They'll just send in the model. Now, the aggregator will combine all these models based on certain heuristic and broadcast back the optimal model to each of these agents. Now, these agents again will optimize over the updated model that they have received and send it back again to these aggregators. So this back and forth process will happen till sufficient accuracy or whatever performance metric we are looking at is achieved. So this is the basic idea of federated learning. Now, the other major issue that is there in such a setting is related to privacy. Can we preserve the information, the input information that is used during the training, including certain other sensitive information which can be used during the loss computation, etc. How are we providing any guarantees for the privacy of this data? So privacy in deep learning corresponds to preserving the training data as well as other sensitive information used during the process of training. So in the federated learning setting, as we discussed before, the agents are not actually revealing their data, but they are just revealing the model. Now, will this help us prevent any privacy leak of their training data? So the answer is no, because there has been several attacks made. One of the most common attack is model inversion attack. So given a trained model, I can infer what the input data was during training. So if in this image we can see the left image is the one using the model inversion attack, it has been inferred, which is pretty close to the actual input image. So just by federated learning, we are not guaranteeing 100% privacy. So what we are focusing on this work is the notion of differential privacy. So then it essentially is trying to introduce some sort of noise in the query function or in the function that the adversary is trying to query with the input data, and so that the output are similar. If the outputs are similar, it is very difficult to know which input. So for different inputs, the output is similar with very high probability. So it's very difficult to figure out what exactly the input is. So that is the basic idea of differential privacy, which provides certain guarantees based on the amount of noise that we have added during the training, which we'll discuss further. Now, we also want to protect the sensitive information that is there in the data, which could be racial, gender, or other kind of information. While we want to preserve the information, we also want to ensure the third important challenge, which is that the predictions from the model is not biased towards a certain demographic group. Now, this bias in the data or the prediction could be due to the existing data, which is already biased, or it could also be due to lack of sufficient samples of a certain demographic group, due to which we are not able to learn very well over those samples. So to address this, we introduce certain fairness notions. So fairness notions in the sense we have certain samples belonging to a specific gender, race, or age. And in certain applications, these attributes can become very sensitive. Especially race is sensitive attribute when we are trying to predict the criminal recidivism rate. Gender is sensitive when we are trying to recruit a particular individual, etc. So, for example, we have a training data where X represents the input features, A is the attribute information, and Y is the label that we are trying to predict. So for a model, let's assume that this is a scenario of predicting whether a candidate is eligible for a job or not eligible for a job. We assume that the attributes, attribute are gender-based and can be either male or female. Now, given X as the input to the model gives us certain predictions, HX. Now, we always train the model for maximum accuracy to mimic the existing data that we have. Now, by ensuring this, what happens is that the model learns to predict any male candidate to be highly eligible as opposed to a female candidate. So the probability for a male candidate to be highly eligible for a job is almost 0.8, let's say, and for the female is significantly less compared to this. So we do not want such disparity in the probabilities. We want them to be close by, ideally zero, which may not be the case in the existing data, but we want the predictions to be unbiased. So that is one form of fairness that we are going to deal with in this work. So the goal of our work is we want to have a federated learning framework wherein we want to ensure some privacy guarantees to protect our training data as well as the sensitive information, while ensuring certain fairness constraints in the prediction of our model. So in order to do so, the main challenge is if we want to introduce privacy, there is a loss of accuracy, which has already been studied before. If we want to introduce fairness constraints, there is again some loss of accuracy that we are facing. And there is also studies which shows that privacy and fairness are also, they do not go well with each other. We cannot have best of all the three. So in this work, we will see what kind of trade-off we can obtain when we use a federated learning model between these three: privacy, fairness, and accuracy that application might want. So this is our goal. So the exact to have more formal definitions for our privacy notion that we use is local differential privacy. So in our model, we ensure the privacy for each of the agents, because each of the agents have their own private data set, and for each of the agents, we define some privacy guarantees. Now, these privacy guarantees are formally defined in this way. Given a set of input X, and we have a randomized algorithm, the algorithm is made randomized based on some noise added to it. it provides certain noisy outputs y tilde. So what is privacy here is the probability with which this randomized algorithm maps two different inputs, x and x tilde, to the same output is bounded by epsilon. Now, this epsilon, if it is very close, if it is very small, then we cannot distinguish between the two inputs x and x tilde with very high probability, which is given by 1 minus delta. And if the epsilon is very large, then the privacy guarantees are very weak. So essentially, epsilon delta are the privacy guarantees that we provide, where epsilon and delta, if they are smaller, it is better for us. So noise, so since it's a randomized algorithm, we have to introduce noise in the training to ensure certain guarantees, and which definitely will compromise our accuracy, which we'll again see further in the results that we get. This is the privacy notion that we will discuss, and next is the fairness notion. So the notion that I defined before, where we would like to offer the positive outcome, the rate at which the positive outcome. In the example that we discussed before, the positive outcome was selecting a candidate for a certain job, or assessing his capability for that particular job, should be same across different demographic groups. So this notion is called demographic parity, and ideally it should be the rate at which the positive outcome is offered is independent of their attribute. Now, this should be exactly same across all the groups, but it's a very stringent condition. So we relax it in our particular notion, and we, even though we can't achieve exact similarity, we'll exact same values across different groups, we'll assume some epsilon, some difference between them. So this is in some sense a bias transforming metric, because in the existing data itself, demographic parity may not hold true. But we wanted to be there in the predictions. So this definitely may hurt our accuracy that we get from the model. So incorporating, so our overall goal is to maximize accuracy under approximate demographic parity constraints, and while we introduce certain calibrated noise for getting some epsilon delta privacy bounds. So this is our goal. So the framework which we use to ensure this in a federated learning setting is as follows. This is our model that we give. So the model has essentially two separate phases. And the first phase is a private thing for each agent. So we have in this figure that we can see, there are M agents involved in this federated learning setting. For each agent, in phase 1, they try to train a multi-layered neural network for ensuring accuracy and fairness over their own private data set. Now, this model is not shared with the aggregator. So this is their private phase, which is not, so nobody has any access to any information of training in this particular phase. In the next phase though, which is our phase 2, where we train another neural network model to mimic the model that we have in a first phase. Now, this model is actually open to the aggregator and any other potential adversary that could be spying on the network. So these models are sent to the aggregator for aggregation, and the aggregator combines all these models using a simple weighted average on these models, where Ni is the number of samples with each agent, and N star is the total number of samples. So it's a simple weighted average over the parameters, and it broadcasts it back. Again, the agents run the phase 2 model, wherein they try to again mimic their own existing θ1 or the models that they have in phase 1, and so on. So here we also introduce noise in the training process in phase 2 to ensure guarantees, because this is the phase which is open to the aggregator or any other adversary. So further in detail, the first phase, which is our FAIR SGD phase 1, for each agent, they have their own data set, which is X, that is the input features, A, the attribute, the sensitive attribute, Y is the label. We provide only X as input to the multi-layered neural network. It could be any network. For our case, it was a two-layered feed-forward network. represented by parameters theta1. Now it provides us certain predictions y hat based on the loss function as defined below. So the loss function has two components to it. First is the classification, the cross entropy loss, which ensures that the classification loss is minimized. We want to maximize accuracy. So the input is y and y hat. And the second component of it is the demographic parity loss, which takes in input the sensitive attribute and the predictions. Based on this, we compute if the demographic parity is 0 or not. If it's not 0, we get some positive loss. So when we try to minimize a combination of both of these, we try to achieve as much as accuracy possible for a certain demographic constraint. Now for optimizing over this, we use stochastic gradient descent, and we try to minimize the theta1, minimize the loss with respect to the network parameters theta1 and maximize it with respect to the Lagrangian multiplier lambda. So this is the Lagrangian dual approach followed for ensuring fairness while maximizing accuracy. So this is the first phase. This is the first phase, and in this phase, the model is trained on the private data set. So there is no leakage of any information whatsoever. Even the model parameters are not shared. So this is the first phase. Now we move on to the second phase. Now the second phase is, we are simply trying to mimic the first phase. And the second phase does not have any access to the attribute information, although it has access to the predictions from the first phase, because we are trying to mimic the first phase. It's like something like a distillation network, student-teacher network. So the input to the network is X. So it still has access to the input features X, but no access to A. And the output, it tries to mimic Y hat using certain predictions Y tilde. So this is simple cross entropy kind of a loss for mimicking that. So during this training, we add certain Gaussian noise to the gradients provided by the stochastic gradient descent approach. This is to ensure data confidentiality or to ensure our differential privacy guarantees. So in this phase, once each agent train their network to mimic the existing network, they send it forth to the aggregator, who again, so this back and forth process of FedML happens only in this phase. So next we move on to the so the decoupling training process of phase 1 and phase 2. What it essentially does is it protects our sensitive attribute, because sensitive attribute is used only in the phase 1, and phase 1 neither the model nor the features are revealed from the phase 1. And it also protects our training data, because the training data is being used in the phase 2, but we are adding noise during the training process and ensuring certain epsilon, like TP guarantees in that. So because of this phase-wise training, we are also able to achieve reduction in the number of training epochs. So if with higher number of epochs, the epsilon bound, the privacy bounds become very loose. So because of the reduced number of epochs, we are able to achieve a better privacy bound, epsilon guarantees. And since we only broadcast the theta2 model to the aggregator or to any adversary, the epsilon delta bounds from the moments accountant given by Awadi et al. Follow for our approach as well. So this is regarding the training of our framework. Now we'll present certain results that we observe. So the first experiment that we have done is on adult dataset. So adult dataset is is a dataset for where the sensitive information is related to the gender. So there are only binary. It's a task of binary classification, where we either predict where we try to predict the income, the amount of the income of a person. It is a binary classification because we assume that any income which is above 50,000 US dollars is 1, and any income below 50,000 US dollars is 0. So it's a binary prediction with binary attributes. Now in the rightmost, we have the baselines in the light blue color, the light blue bars. So the baseline 1 or B1 represents the accuracy from a network which is trained without fairness constraints and without any DP, any privacy guarantees. So we can see that the accuracy is quite high, which is 87%, as high that is achievable on adult dataset. And the demographic parity is quite high as well. So there is a lot of unfairness in, which is close to 0.17. The epsilon is infinite because there's no privacy guarantee at all. So the sensitivity, there's no sense, because of the sensitivity, there's the epsilon is infinite, unbounded. And then for the second baseline, which is B2, we try to train the network with fairness constraints, but without any privacy guarantees. Now, with this, what happens is the epsilon is still infinite, but there is slight reduction in the accuracy. We lose out, like we get 85% accuracy, but the DP guarantees are, the demographic parity guarantees are way better. They are almost close to zero. So now these are the two baselines. Compared to these baselines, we observe that as and when we introduce noise, the variance, the noise, we introduce Gaussian noise, and the and we keep on changing the sigma variance in the noise to get different guarantees of epsilon. We observe that as epsilon decreases, we either lose out on accuracy or we lose out on the fairness guarantees that we can have in this particular data set. So,
Manisha,
yes.
Sorry for the interruption. Maybe you can take 2 more minutes.
Okay, okay, it's almost done. So we also have similar experiments on bank data set. The results are not as smooth. This is probably because of the lack of enough samples in the data set, which are also being distributed among 5 different agents in the Fed-ML setting, which further reduces the number of samples each agent has. So in future, we would like to extend this to bigger data set, which essentially, vision data sets or something. Or we'd also like to incorporate other kinds of fairness metrics like equalized odds and accuracy parity, etc., to see the trade-off for them as well. And we'd also like to use other loss function for the FAIR SGD, the phase 1 model, instead of just the Lagrangian multiplier method. We'll want to use other sort of methods to ensure fairness. Other than this, we'd also like to use Bayesian DP approaches to obtain tighter DP. So these are a few relevant references. Thank you. Thank you for attending it.
Thanks, Manisha. So do we have any questions from the panelists?
This is Arun. Hi, Manisha. Great talk. I have a very high level, specific question, maybe not a high level question. So you said you would add like Gaussian noise to preserve privacy, right? So, but is it typically Laplacian noise that is added to preserve differential privacy? And you might lose something if you do a Gaussian noise?
Okay. So I asked some question to address this.
Hello. Am I audible?
Yes.
So Laplacian noise is typically used when you want to give pure DP guarantees, and they are not really useful in practice. So once we also add the factor of delta, we can actually reduce the overall epsilon value, which is more practical and more usable. So Laplacian is also another technique. It is commonly used, but since we want to give a more practical approach, the epsilon delta differential privacy bounds are more preferred as compared to Laplace.
So what do you gain by this?
So we basically gain a smaller epsilon. So typically, if I use the Laplace noise, I will get epsilon dp, and if I use the Gaussian noise, I'll get epsilon delta dp. So this delta factor is basically the probability with which the epsilon guarantee is not provided. So once I introduce this delta factor, my epsilon will also reduce, right? So this is more practically usable. We are able to get smaller epsilons, which are way more desirable.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, are there any more questions from the panelists? Okay, if not, I think let's thank Manisha once again for the talk. So thank you, Manisha. So we will now be moving on to the next talk, which is automated incident location identification from historic ambulance geospatial data. This is by Shruti Kirti Nandita R, Gautam Sampani, Gokul S. Krishnan and Geeta Krishnan Ramadurai.
Yeah. Hello, sir. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah.
So yeah, just a reminder, keep it like the talk time duration is like 20 minutes.
Sure, sir. Yeah, screen is visible, I hope.
Yes. But I think it's not full screen or something.
Yeah. Yes. So greetings of the time, everyone. I'm Gokul. So we are here to present today an abstract on titled Automated Incident Location Identification from Historic Ambulance Geospatial Data. My teammates are Shruti Kirti, Gautam, and Geeta Krishnan sir. So we have an acknowledgement to give. We gratefully acknowledge Tamil Nadu Health System Project, which is actually part of a World Bank funded project. We also thank GVK EMRI for the support and the data which we have used for the study. So EMRI, Emergency Management and Research Institute, is a leading emergency medical service provider in India, which is basically the 108 ambulance service. So as per the 2018 data, we have like around 150,000 calls coming every day across India. So they are able to address like 24,000 emergency requests. So we can see that there is a constant need to optimize and utilize the resources more judiciously so that we can get the maximum potential out of it. And the most important component in any EMS is, of course, the ambulances. And they generate a lot of geospatial data, which we can analyze. And this analytics on this data can actually help us improve the EMS care delivery. So we are hoping that once, in the ultimate end of this project, we are able to, they are already saving a lot of lives. We are hoping that we can help them save more lives. So let me just take you through the current Indian scenario of the EMS. So basically a caller calls the call center and requests for a service, emergency service. The caller explains the kind of emergency type that is happened at that particular location, and they describe the incident location. So the personnel who is listening in the call center understands this and allocates an ambulance near that and dispatch it to the incident location. So we can see that actually there is only a description of the location in the data which gets stored. So there are two types of data, GPS data and the call records data. So we don't have actually a direct geospatial coordinates or GPS coordinates for the incident location. And actually, when the ambulance reaches the incident location, the health personnel are more focused on saving the life and taking that patient to the hospital. So they also should not depend, ideally, they should not be burdened with any other process for them to report the incident location. So basically, we don't have that stored along with the other data. So, but this is actually very important for us to have, right? We need this for in the future. We may need this for optimally placing the ambulances or allocating the ambulances as and when the request comes in, and also the historic quality evaluation of the emergency medical service that is being provided. So in this work, we present an AI-based approach that can automatically identify the incident location from the historic geospatial data. So this is the overall proposed approach. We are having the geospatial data and the call records data. We reconstruct the trajectory using the timestamps which is there in the call data. We detect the stops. And finally, we are applying one distance heuristic implementation, which is a novel implementation. And finally, we identify the incident location. So to explain more, I request Shruti to take over.
Thanks a lot, Gokul. So we are, as mentioned before, we are using two different data sets for this approach. Next slide. So there's the GPS data from the ambulances, and there's the call request data that has been placed to the 108 system in Tamil Nadu. We are considering a period from 20th August 2020 to 8th December 2020 in 5 districts of Tamil Nadu, which are Chennai, Tiruvallur, Chengalpet, Tiruvannamalai, and Kanchipuram. This is to ensure that there is an even distribution of the rural and urban area call request placed to the system. So the GPS data we get is in the form of a triple. So there is a timestamp at which the record has been, GPS data has been recorded and the coordinates itself. The call request details consist of a bit more information regarding the patient, the informer, the type of emergency, etc. So it also consists of the timestamp of when the call was placed to the system, when the ambulance was departed from the base, and when it arrives at scene, and when it hands over the victim to the hospital. And we also use the case closure information that's given here. Call request is considered to be closed when the ambulance picks up a patient from the scene and admits them to a hospital. So this from base to scene to hospital is deemed as a closed case. Next slide. We are presenting some basic analysis of the call request details in the given period. So we can see that there's a distribution of the call requests across districts in the selected period. And we find that Chennai is receiving the highest number of requests. So we can see that the volume of the requests received by the system is humongous. So manual intervention to decode the textual description of the incident location is a very hectic and a time-consuming process. So the dire need to automate this process to get the incident location is very much required because of the future works that's related to the EMS system. Next slide. So we also have a distribution of the types of emergencies in the selected periods in the 5 districts. So we can find that pregnancy-related and vehicular trauma requests are found to be the maximum number of requests that are placed. So in case of vehicular trauma, the description of the incident location will not be precise because it's mostly in the middle of the roads or in the highways that it occurs. So when we automate the process of finding the incident location, it becomes more easier for the ambulance to find the patient and decrease the response time required for the ambulance to reach the scene. Next slide. So we have also provided a distribution of the calls, that number of calls that are received by the system across each hour of the day and every day of the week. We can find that the weekend days, that such as the Saturday and Sunday days, have a peak, that is the blue and the pink line. And we also find that the morning hours, that is from 9 to 12, are when the maximum number of requests are placed to the system as well. Next slide. So as per our approach, we are reconstructing the trajectory followed by the ambulance for every single request that is placed in the system. So the GPS coordinates of the ambulance is emitted every 7 to 10 seconds, irrespective of whether the ambulance is allocated to a case or whether it's stationary or anything. So we need to find the GPS locations corresponding to every single call. This is actually pertinent to the next step that we are doing in our approach. So we've taken the timestamp of when the call is received by the system and to the timestamp that when the ambulance reaches the hospital. So the GPS data in between these two timestamps is considered as a trajectory, and we are reconstructing the path that is followed by the ambulance. So this trajectory for every single request is passed on to the stop detection algorithm in the next module. Next slide. So we have used a clustering-based graph community detection algorithm called InfoStop. So this algorithm actually takes in the spatio-temporal data and classifies every single data point into a stay or a trip point. A stay point is when the data point, when the vehicle is said to be in a stationary mode, and the trip point is when it is said to be in a moving mode. So these stay points are actually identified using a set of parameters, and the links are created between the stay points to identify the communities in the network. Destinations are the clusters of stops in the trajectory that we are passing. And again, they are identified by nearby stay points with the time and the distance parameter that is passed. So the medians of these clusters are computed for the further processing of our approach. Next slide. So as mentioned, we have 4 parameters that are taken in for the InfoStop algorithm. First one is the maximum distance between 2 points for the point to be declared as a stationary point. So we have used that parameter as 10 meters, that is the minimum distance, maximum distance between 2 points. And the next parameter that we have is the minimum distance between 2 stationary points to be deemed in the same cluster. So this is ideally the cluster radius of the communities that we are detecting. So we have considered that as 200 meters, and the minimum duration of stay, that is minimum time duration for which the vehicle should be stationary to be considered as a stationary point is taken as 120 seconds, and the maximum duration for 2 stay points to be considered as a single cluster is 30 minutes, that is 1800 seconds. Next slide, please. So we had performed an empirical parameter analysis to identify the ideal value that we could consider for the stop detection algorithm. So we have passed the minimum duration of stay, that is the T-min value, as 60 seconds, 90 seconds, and 120 seconds. So we can see that when the time duration is increased to 120 seconds, the number of calls which is detecting multiple stoppages is reducing. These multiple stops can be even like traffic stops, or when the ambulance stops in a place to inquire for directions to the scene, etc. So this actually gives us a more clear idea of what are the stops that have been detected in the trajectory. So when we take the value as 60 seconds, we can see that the number of stops that have been detected, like if the ambulance has been stationary in a signal or in the U-turn point or something, even these stops would be considered by the algorithm. We did not increase the minimum duration beyond 120 seconds because when we analyzed the call request details, it was found that the time spent by the ambulance or the emergency medical technician at the scene is ranging from 2 minutes to 30 minutes. So this is the reason why we have chosen 30 minutes as the maximum duration of the stay class, maximum duration to identify a cluster as well. Next slide, please. So we have developed a distance heuristic from scratch. I invite Gautam to explain about this module.
Thank you, Shruti. So moving on, we have a set of stops from the clustering algorithm. Now we need to identify which is exactly the incident location among all the stops. So we developed something called a distance heuristic, which will help us identify the incident location. The fundamental idea is that we want to see how much the ambulance is deviating from the shortest path between the base location and the hospital. To do that, we first calculate the shortest distance between the base and the hospital, which is called D. And we also calculate the distance from the base location to stop, which is X, and from the shortest distance between stop and the hospital, which is called Y. So the stop, which we do it for all the stops which are come out of the clustering algorithm, and the stop for which the deviation is maximum, it is taken out to be the incident location. So we have an example here. This is one of the calls out of the data set we used. So the blue marker is the base location and the green marker is the incident location. Sorry, the green marker is the hospital. So apart from the blue and green markers, there are a couple of stops which have been identified by the clustering algorithm. So now we need to find which is the incident location among both of these. So we calculate the shortest distance between the hospital and the base, and next. And we also calculate the distance between base and the first stop, which is let's call it X1. Next slide, please. And we calculate the shortest distance between the stop, the first stop and the hospital. We call it Y1. So we take the difference. Well, let's call it offset 1, X1 plus Y1 minus 1. Next slide. So we do the same thing again for the second stop. Let's call it X2 and Y2. So we calculate the offset, which is X2 plus Y2 minus 3, and we find that X1, offset 1 is greater than offset 2. So this is the ultimately the algorithm concludes this to be the incident location. Next slide. So we have a small visualization of the entire trajectory. As you can see, the red line is the ambulance on its way to incident location, and the blue line. So it has stopped at the incident location, and the blue line is the ambulance going from the incident location to the hospital. this is another result where actually the deviation is very small, as you can see in the zoomed in picture, but still the algorithm is able to predict the incident location. So our data set comprises of 92 call requests, and we calculated offsets for the entire all the calls, and we found out on an average the deviation is 3.2 kilometers. Now we'll have a look at the distribution of the deviation for the entire data set. As you can notice in the zoomed in graph, there are around 10% of the calls which have deviation closer to 0. But the algorithm, actually, most of them have stops, only one stop. Sorry. Most of those calls have only one stop in them. So the algorithm is able to directly give out the incident location. But as I also showed in the last example, the deviation could be actually small, but still the algorithm is able to give the incident location out. And the values where you see there's a large deviation, those are mostly interfacility transfers, or the base and hospital location are actually the same. So in conclusion, we use a clustering based algorithm coupled with a distance heuristic to find the incident location automatically. Given the data which is generated on a daily basis, this would really help in finding the incident locations faster and analyzing the entire data fast, which would further help in optimizing the resources of emergency medical services. So in our future work, we are trying to validate our results by establishing the ground truth. As of now, we have the incident location data in a very text format, and we are trying to convert that text format into exact coordinates so that we can calculate an error and the precision. So we are also trying to improvise on the precision of the incident location identification and also the exceptional handling. Next. Thank you, everyone. We are open to questions.
Thanks for the talk. Do we have any questions from the panelists? So if there are no questions from the panelists, actually, I have a question. So, so these locations that you are finding, is it possible? Can you comment a bit about whether it is possible to kind of characterize the road network that's in and around these accident-prone regions? Is that a possible outcome as a side prediction? Can you do that?
Yes.
Or,
So we have the type of emergency that has been received by the system. So in the call request details, we have what is the type, like we had displayed the distribution earlier. So for the vehicular trauma cases, we can actually identify a heat map or a feature map of sorts to identify the hotspot regions in the road network.
right. So what I was getting at is, say, suppose you have these hotspots, and then you sort of look at, can you mine some kind of pattern about the road networks that are kind of causing these accidents? Maybe there is a, and maybe that can go as a, policy kind of a recommendation saying that, these kind of roads are kind of causing accidents. So is that a possibility that you are thinking about? Or yeah.
We would need much more data about the roads and exactly how the curves are and everything. Right now, we are getting most of the information from OpenStreetMaps. So regarding the road network, so I don't think if we can comment to that finer extent about how the road conditions are, but we can definitely comment on a macro level.
So we'll be able to identify the hotspot regions in the network, but then to comment on the road network itself, we would be requiring much more data and further analysis.
Okay. So yeah. Yeah.
If I can come in, this is Geeta Krishnan here. Yeah, I think there is a lot more data beyond the 108, right? So it's not like all the road accidents are actually picked up by 108 ambulances. So there could be a lot of other trauma cases which are picked up by other hospital ambulances, or people themselves pick up the patient in a car or an auto rickshaw and transport them. So if you only analyze using this data, it may actually be a biased sample. So we do analyze data from the police, and the police has a much larger database of all types of accidents picked up by different ambulance types and vehicles. That data, I think, is much more suitable to do the kind of analysis you were mentioning. With this data, if you do, I think it may be a bit biased.
Okay. Okay, so if there are not any more questions, then can thank the speaker.